vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Spre țărul pe drum știut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. E pentru că pe lume partidul s-a câte dulci cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut.
И невостяк, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И он продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Allahu Akbar, Khomeini Rahbar. Allahu Akbar, Khomeini Rahbar.
این بانگ آزادی کز خاوران خیزد، فریاد انسان هاست کز نای جان خیزد، اعلام طوفان هاست کز هر کران خیزد، آتش فشان قهر ملت های در بند است، حبل المتین توده های آرزومند است.
Allahu Akbar, Khomeini Rahbar. Allahu Akbar, Khomeini Rahbar.
دشمن بداند ما موج خروشانیم، زایده بحریم فرزند طوفانیم، در سنگر اسلام بگذشته از جانیم، بازو به بازو صف به صف ما آهنین چنگیم، سنگر به سنگر جان به کف آماده جنگیم. واژگون از ما، بخت تبهکاران شد واژگون از ما، دامان آزادی شد لالگون از ما. ما حافظ آزادی و اسلام و قرآنیم، ما در پی آسایش و معراج انسانیم.
الله اکبر خمینی رهبر، الله اکبر خمینی رهبر.
ما در ره اسلام پیمان خون بستیم، زنجیر استعمار مردان بگسستیم، از دام اهریمن با یاد حق رستیم. ما نغمه الله اکبر بر زبان داریم، ما چون خمینی رهبری روشن روان داریم.
الله اکبر خمینی رهبر، الله اکبر خمینی رهبر، الله اکبر خمینی رهبر.
Greetings, everybody. I'm just going to make a slight adjustment to the camera here because we are, greetings, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 24th of June, 2025, and you join us here for a live stream looking at the consequences of the declared ceasefire. Now, it is a declared ceasefire between nominally between Israel and Iran, but we all know that in reality this is a declared ceasefire between Israel and U.S. imperialism, or more to the point, the U.S.-led imperialist bloc. Now, why have they done this? In short, it is because the calculations that were made by the U.S. imperialists and by their Israeli stooge regime were wrong. They looked at the government and state structure in Iran and fought quite seriously that with a military decapitation strategy, and again, we still don't know the full extent of the damage done by that, but we know several senior officers from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps were killed by the initial U.S.-Israel strikes on Iran. This was a serious attempt, as Trump, in fact, blabbered about all over Truth Social. This was a serious attempt at carrying out a regime change operation inside Iran. Now, I have talked about this on previous streams, but just to reiterate, the plan goes as follows. Massive assault, decapitation strategy, combined with widespread terroristic assassination and sabotage operations by long-term embedded networks of agents and collaborators within Iran, that was meant to convey to the Iranian population a sense of imminent collapse, with the hope that would do it in terms of either getting, and we know that Mossad has been ringing up Iranian officers, senior officers directly. I mean, we'll get on to Iranian security practices in a moment, but the hope was that they would somehow secure, I think what they wanted to secure was some sort of palace coup. That's what they were after, that maybe some officers from like the wider Iranian military outside the Revolutionary Guard Corps would maybe enact some kind of coup. Maybe there would be some kind of semi-uprising, or at least the appearance of an uprising that could then justify a coup and the removal of the governmental structure of the Islamic Republic, the crushing of the Basij, popular mobilization units. And this would then facilitate what they hoped to achieve through that strike, these strikes, which was the collapse of the government of Iran and the turning over of the government of Iran to some puppet or another. I mean, it seemed that the US was making a serious push to boost the career prospects of the man who would be king, the son of the last Shah, though he appears to be a despised and loathed figure, even amongst other Iranian compradors. So quite who thought that was a good idea is another question. But this, make no mistake about it, this was a serious attempt at a regime change operation. And it became clear really within 24 hours that it hadn't worked. And because the state structure, though it was rocked by the combination of external attack and internal sabotage, did, of course, wobble, but it didn't wobble too much. The Iranian government didn't fall apart. They replaced those who had been killed by the strikes with other officers very quickly, and were able to start conducting revenge strikes on Israel within 24 hours. So this a serious attempt at regime change failed. And after it failed, it became clear that the US didn't have any other moves. This is made obvious by the fact that, like, the Israelis, despite the fact that they had done significant damage to Iranian air defense systems, moved to firing most of their ordinances that they fired at Iranian targets were fired from Iraqi airspace rather than being over Iran itself. There were some raids over Iran, but a lot of this was done firing what are referred to as standoff weapons from over Iraqi airspace, not taking the risk of going directly into Iran itself. So we still are unclear how much damage was done to the Iranian air defense systems, most of which was actually done with, again, this was facilitated by CIA, MI6, Mossad agents or collaborators on the ground in Iran itself, providing the targeting information to the Israeli Air Force. So this is the state of things now, is that the regime change operation did not work. The attempt to decapitate the entirety of the Iranian government didn't work. Quite how close they came to killing Ayatollah Khamenei is another question. We don't know about that. Whether they tried to kill Pezeshkian is another question. In my view, they'd be far better off leaving him alive. So the failure of the operation was followed by, of course, significant damage being done to Israel, some of which I clipped and put in that compilation with an old Iranian revolutionary song from about 1980. What they wanted to do was to avoid getting drawn into a prolonged exchange of fire with the Iranians, but particularly because they know the Iranians can accurately target many different areas inside Israel, and they were accurately hitting a number of military, industrial, scientific, and technological and political targets. They were also taxing the Israeli air defense system, the Iron Sieve, David's Sling, whatever bizarre pseudo-biblical names they want to come up with for these things. But the Iranians were taxing that to capacity. In fact, it was about to become over-taxed to the point where it almost collapsed, because the US and Israel, or particularly merely the US, can't produce replacement missiles in enough time to keep up with the demands that were being placed on those systems, which are meant to deal with sporadic homemade rocket fire from Palestinian resistance groups. They're not meant to sustain damage, to guard against long-term serious bombardment from a country like Iran. So the the Israeli regime was suffering a lot of damage. The fissures that have always been there and always threatened to explode within the Israeli regime were becoming more and more obvious. Even Israeli propaganda channels were admitting that there were class divisions opening up in Israel between, of course, the bourgeois and everyone else, because it was the Israeli bourgeois, who are mostly American, or they certainly have a lot of passports between them. A lot of them are Americans. Were getting out by whatever means necessary, whatever means available to them, running off to Israel too, which is, unfortunately for Cypriots, has been made in Cyprus, going back to whichever country they originated from. And what you were faced with was, if this went on, of course, the US can reach out and continue to damage Iran, but the damage to Israel was going to be huge and was going to provoke a potential crisis of the Israeli state, which is already in a severe economic crisis, which is running out of air defense missiles, which is facing severe morale issues in its army, which is facing increasing isolation, internationally speaking, whose propaganda system has fallen apart. All of this is correct, and of course was already dealing with, from over 2 years ago, a crisis of legitimacy within its own state structure because of the machinations of Netanyahu. There was already a huge division within Israeli society, which has got worse. So you've got a lot of severe problems, which the Iranian missile campaign was making worse and making more and more obvious. So if this had carried on much longer, the damage done to Israel, indeed, possibly raising questions over its sustainability, and that raises other interesting questions. So this ceasefire that Trump has pulled out of his ass is really about preserving the Israeli regime, because it couldn't have lasted too much longer had it just kept being hit over and over and over again. It would have created a severe crisis within the Israeli regime. So that's why this has been agreed to. That's a big part of the reason why this has been agreed to. The other reasons, of course, are that China behind the scenes and Russia more publicly made it clear that their partnership with Iran is very valuable, and they're not prepared to see the Iranian system collapse under the weight of US assaults. Now here it was here's what Trump had to say about all of this in his press statement earlier today. So enjoy this.
I don't think so, but I'm not happy that Israel's going out now. There was one rocket that I guess was fired overboard. It was after the time limit, and it missed its target. And now Israel's going out. These guys got to calm down. It's ridiculous. I didn't like plenty of things I saw yesterday. I didn't like the fact that Israel unloaded right after we made the deal. They didn't have to unload. And I didn't like the fact that the retaliation was very strong. But in all fairness, Israel unloaded a lot. And now I hear Israel just went out because they felt it was violated by one rocket that didn't land anywhere. That's not what we want, I'll tell you. And I'm telling you, I'm not happy about that, Israel, either.
Right, so I hope you all got that. He's not happy with Israel, so they say. That, of course, is bullshit. And if you fall for that one, frankly, you need your fucking head examined. Because the ceasefire is to preserve the Israeli regime and to get the US out of a hole that it dug for itself. Because it became obvious, and again, if you observed our recent Decline and Fall episodes, you'll have seen myself and Kit Clarenberg look specifically at these questions, which is that, does the US have what it takes to actually take out Iran, militarily speaking? And the answer is, of course, no, they don't. This has been obvious for quite some time. The US doesn't have 1.5 million men to spare. They don't have the capacity to produce the replacements for all the military material they would lose, because if they actually want to take out the Iranian government, they can't just rely on bombing. They'd have to invade, and they can't sustain the level of casualties, politically speaking, that would take to do that. So they tried the decapitation strategy. It hasn't worked. It led to severe damage being done to Israel. So now they're trying another tactic, because the only way that the US can get what it needs, and I'll get on to why it needs this in just a moment, the only way to for the US to get what it needs, which is to collapse the Islamic Republic, is to actually combine air power, maybe like missiles launched from naval assets, but combined with sabotage operations, psychological warfare, maybe a color revolution, all of those things. Basically, the models that they've worked off in over the last 30 years. So the kind of things that you said that you see from like the US when it comes to like the Yugoslav wars, when it comes to, of course, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, or less bloody color revolutions like Georgia in the early 2000s, or Armenia, or Ukraine itself, though that turned out to be very bloody, because the objective requirement that the US imperialism has remains the same, which is they have to take out and destroy Russia, they have to destroy China, and they have to destroy Iran. And Iran is linked increasingly to Russia and China. And so it makes the urgency from the US imperialists' point of view ever more desperate. They have to have some progress on these things. Otherwise, their system's going to lurch into a deeper and deeper crisis. The Ukraine war has gone appallingly badly, and they're losing that. Their proxy is now going to be destroyed. Incidentally, Putin somewhat casually confirmed, in my mind, what I have long argued, which is that they're going to march. The Russian army is going to march to Kiev and take it, and they're going to take everything down to Odessa and see what happens then. Because they've worked out that the only way they're going to be able to actually deal with the Kiev regime is to absolutely destroy it. So that's just an incidental. But the point is that the US is not getting the win it needed. They drastically miscalculated about the nature of the Russian governmental system and their ability to withstand sanctions. They got their intelligence on the economic setup in Russia was drastically and horrifically wrong. And ever since 2012, the Russians have been systematically shutting down the US and British and European influencing operations and sources of psychological warfare that were present in Russia all through the 90s and 2000s. So their attempt at color revolution just did not work. And this is this reflects a catastrophic failure from the US's point of view. So they have come back. They've come back again to trying things against Iran. Bear in mind, they've tried multiple times to destroy the Islamic Republic. The first, as I said in the first stream I did after the attacks on Iran recently, the first attempt to destroy the Islamic Republic was done by via the forces of Ba'athist Iraq, headed by Saddam Hussein. That was an 8-year war which killed over 1 million people, and again failed. They've tried via sanctions. They've tried to instigate color revolutions. Remember the Green Movement of all the way back in, I think it was 2009. Serious attempt at a color revolution there. Sabotage operations, assassination campaigns, terrorism done by Balochi separatists, Kurdish separatists, the MEK, that bizarre cult that Rudy Giuliani works for, and various others who are hired by CIA, MI6, and Mossad. A lot of whom, incidentally, are Afghan migrants who are it seems to me the most dirt poor and spat upon section of the population of Iran. So when it comes to Iran, the judgments made by the US and others are, again, not been equally as faulty, because they know how to identify people who can be easily paid to become agents of the West. So there's been a lot of Afghans arrested, apparently, and Ukrainians. 2 or 3 Ukrainians have been arrested and apparently quickly sentenced to death. So I hope you got the long service medal from NATO, lads. But the US is adept at finding and exploiting contradictions within Iranian society, probably better at it at that than they are with the equivalent when it comes to Russia. So the threat to Iran was actually not going to be from a frontal assault from the United States. The United States can't do that, can't mobilize the necessary manpower. And a frontal assault by the US and Israel, as it turned out, did the opposite of weaken the system. It caused Iranians to rally behind it. So they're going to switch tactics. My guess is that what the US will probably do is now try and mobilize more of their sabotage and assassination and terrorism assets inside Iran. They may well try more color revolution stuff. They may well also try a different approach, because the frontal assault option quite clearly isn't going to work. Using Israel as the battering ram wasn't going to work either. That didn't work. So what's the other the way you can do this? The other way you can do this, and this is where they may try for this now, is to secure the internal rot of the Iranian government and state. What do I mean by internal rot? Well, this is something that was practiced very effectively by US imperialism during the later period of the Cold War, with the increasingly pro-capitalist turn that the leadership of the USSR was taking and the leadership of the people's democracies were taking. US and other imperialist capital was able to find its way into the socialist bloc nations. Just check on how many socialist bloc people's democracies in the east of Europe took big IMF loans from like the mid-60s onwards. It was all of them. Most egregious examples being Yugoslavia and Poland. It played a big part in ruining both of them. But what happened was that the people's democracies got rotted away from within, as did the USSR, via the increasing penetration in terms of the people's democracies of Western capital into those countries, and the rotting away of the leadership of these of the parties and states. Excuse me a moment. This reached the point where you had the so-called, what I would call like the first big examples of color revolutions in the world, which came in like 1989 to 91. And these were done in using very similar methods to that which is used by the US and the British and the Europeans today, which is that you mobilize a street force, which they effectively did. Though it should be emphasized that though the demonstrations in places like Prague and Bucharest and East Berlin were sizable, they were not the gigantic population representative demonstrations that they were portrayed as. What you do is you mobilize in the streets, and then the other way you do it is you basically secure defections from within. You particularly in the intelligence and military spheres. And the people's democracies of the east of Europe were relatively easy to knock over in the end, because they were completely alienated from the masses. The leaders of these countries had long since given up on the pursuit of socialism as anything other than a rhetorical device on May Day. These were people who had already effectively accepted capitalism, and they were moving towards it. If not the people at the top, such as Ceausescu or Todor Zivkov, they probably didn't. But the people in the all around them and the people in the layers of the party and state below them have become completely corroded and pro-capitalist in their point of view. They've become a bourgeoisie within the ruling party, as was the case in the Soviet Union. So those were the first big color revolutions, and that's an example of how the rot within the ruling party and state can make it so that the imperialists don't even have to fire a shot to destroy you. And that model that was used very effectively to destroy the people's democracies in the east of Europe and the Soviet Union itself. And they will, I think, they've tried to apply that to Iran in various different ways. They've tried to apply the method of corroding the system. This is what the JCPOA was meant to do in the restoration of relations in the Obama era. Obama was and his advisors were a lot smarter than Trump's guys, which is that they realized, and this was a cleverer period in U.S. imperialism, they realized that they could, by getting U.S. and British and European capital more access to Iran, they could secure for themselves the allegiances of a stronger comprador elite that would do their bidding for them and would essentially prepare the ground for the reintegration of Iran into the US-led system. And here I will just go on a bit of a digression towards like our understanding of this US-led system. The US-led system, generally referred to in academic literature as globalization, the era of globalization. This was talked about a lot when I was a student 20 years ago now, and when I was an undergraduate, and there was an awful lot of words expended upon it, but what we need to sort of evaluate what this actually meant. What this actually was, as I have said before, is essentially the US being able to extend a neo-colonial system over huge areas of the world that it had been previously either shut out of or very limited in its ability to exploit the labor and resources and gain access to the markets of these areas. Suddenly, everybody in the world, every country in the world, no longer had any alternatives with the disappearance of the USSR. What happened was that everybody suddenly had to join the IMF, World Bank. A lot of countries suddenly applied to join the World Trade Organization. And these institutions were provided, along with some others, but these are the big ones. These provided the governance structure by which the US and the British in particular would build a neo-colonial system that would enable them to exploit almost every country in the world. And due to the US control over the international payments system via dollar hegemony, they would secure their position as the center of this global neo-colonial operation, which would see, of course, US manufacturing jobs and British and European outsourced and offshored to areas where labor could be hyper exploited, particularly like the Southeast Asia, South Asia, China, Bangladesh, India, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, which provide now the great bulk of the goods, commodities sold to us in the West. And this was the period of complete monopolar US dominance. And what it did was because of the penetration of US and other Western capital into almost every nation in the world without limits, because that's one of the big things that the US insists on. It's frictionless trade, meaning that US capital gets to move anywhere it wants without any limitation being put on it. And that's one of the cornerstones of so-called globalization. And if you try and restrict the ability of US capital to go anywhere, then the US will send in the gunboats against you if they can. The reason why they went psychotic about Putin, though he, again, I will always emphasize, just is the first amongst equals in a Russian governmental system that is in reality a Bonapartist one. The reason why they went so psycho about Putin was because he started to put restrictions on the movements of US capital into and out of Russia. It is clear that as soon as Putin started asserting some basic control over capital inside, particularly foreign capital inside the borders of the Russian Federation, that's when the US and the British and the others all turned on him very, very quickly into his first term as being president. The demonization started then. I make this point because what the period of globalization does, particularly for smaller and medium countries, is it breeds more and more compradors. So if you're a bourgeois with aspirations of growing your enterprises, particularly in like an ex-Soviet state like Ukraine or Armenia or Azerbaijan or the Central Asian republics, if you're a bourgeois in that system, and these are a particularly parasitic and useless bunch as well. If you want to cash in and cash out on your assets, then one of the big buyers for your assets or investors in your assets is going to be in the 90s and the 2000s, US imperialism, British imperialism, and the Europeans. So their influence in all these countries grew exponentially throughout the 90s, and particularly early to mid 90s in particular, as they knocked down every barrier to US quote unquote investment or British or European investment in a country. And of course, because the US, Britain were able to move such massive amounts of capital around, and they found ready collaborators everywhere. Because if you can move that much money, and the US and the British in particular have gigantic amounts of capital that Britain has accumulated over the course of at least 400, possibly 500 years, you suddenly have the ability to move that anywhere in the world. You're going to find an awful lot of compradors want to get on board with that. And that's one of the sources of continuing British power in this new era, in this post-1991 era, the deindustrialized era in British terms, as industries sent outside of the domestic, of the homeland. So what does all this mean in terms of Iran? What it means in terms of Iran is that one of the plans in place is to secure for themselves a reliable set of compradors who can grow in power inside Iran. Now, Iran's system, as we've gone into in the interview we did with Comrade Bahmanazar from the 10 Mehr movement, you can find that in the back catalogue on the YouTube channel. Iran's system is one which has multiple factions within it. There are national bourgeois elements, comprador bourgeois elements, all proletarian elements, petty bourgeois elements, all competing within the Iranian political system. The current government is a government which is defined by, I would say, the comprador bourgeoisie. That's a big part of the reason why the Iranian government didn't take that military partnership with the Russians. Is because at heart, the comprador bourgeois who are behind Pezeshkian desperately, beyond anything else, want to partner with or be the loyal representatives of the imperialist capital, finance capital from London and from Washington in particular. And that's what they're after. And to get that, they're prepared to sell Iran down the river completely. And Pezeshkian is their man. So keep that in mind. And their power is one of the reasons, I think it's the biggest single defining reason, why the policy on uranium enrichment and nuclear weapons is contradictory and nonsensical. It's a big part of the reason why, despite the US openly broadcasting that they essentially want to return Iran to the position it held during the days of the Shah, these bourgeois creeps are more than prepared to continue collaborating or trying to collaborate with US imperialism. So you've got, on the one level, the collaborators with CIA, Mossad, MI6 that Iran is picking up. So like all these Afghans they're arresting, so who come from the dirt poor sections of like the hyper exploited working class in Iran, who will who are often the subject of like hyper exploitation by Iranian bourgeois. Pretty easy to buy those people off given their dirt poor position and the fact that they're distrusted and spat upon by many in Israeli society, Iranian society, I should say. But also, it's not just the dirt poor Afghans who are doing the selling out. It also comes from the top. So you've got your saboteurs at the bottom of the Iranian societies, and you have your more high class, more high income saboteurs at the top. And those are the people who are truly dangerous, because those are the people with real influence over what the government does and doesn't do. Those are the people who backed Pezeshkian. Those are the people who backed previous Iranian so-called reformist presidents like Khatami. And those are the people who are still desperate for a deal with US imperialism. They would go back to the negotiating table now if they could get away with it. Now, this leads us into one of the reasons why a ceasefire was agreed to. And this is my interpretation here. You saw rallying behind the leadership of Ayatollah Khamenei inside Iran. And you saw mass demonstrations of patriotic Iranians, some of them shouting revolutionary slogans. And it is my analysis that much as the same as with Russia, the longer the war went on, one of the risks to the Iranian comprador bourgeoisie was that the revolutionary and radical sentiments amongst the population would increase and would turn on them. Now, I think that is one of the reasons why the Iranian government agreed to this ceasefire. Now, maybe they were also told that this would be a good move by the Russians and the Chinese. We don't know what was said in those discussions of it. Is the Iranian comprador bourgeoisie grabbing the first agreement to them? That is obvious. Now, it may be argued that Iran won this encounter on points. If we're going to use a boxing analogy, I would say that's accurate. The damage to the Israeli regime is real, and for all the censorship they've been engaging in, they can't quite hide that. But again, like, the damage done to Iran was real as well. So let's, as the great African revolutionary Amilcar Cabral once said, claim no easy victories and tell no lies to the masses. Iran was damaged by the initial Israeli strikes. It revealed a massive Mossad, CIA, MI6 operation on the ground. There may be, I think there probably will be more infiltrators. I mean, I don't think we've seen a major move done by the MEK as yet, but I could be wrong about that. And we don't think we've seen the last of the sabotage and terrorism operations run by the American-led bloc inside Iran. What they're doing with the ceasefire is, of course, they are regathering their forces. They're trying to recalculate their assault. And the other part of it is, of course, that Trump suddenly, in his Truth Social post, seemed to realize that if Iran did something like closing the Strait of Hormuz, or even just restricting it, there was a risk that oil prices would jump up and he would be in the political firing line for that. So the overall verdict is that, of course, Iran survived the assault, but has severe problems. There are severe problems in the Iranian system. There are real antagonisms there that they will need to deal with. They will need to be able to rebuild their air defense and their radar systems, which have been clearly targeted heavily by the US and the side. And they will need to rebuild those in a way which makes their airspace sealed off again, because you can't have the US imperialists able to fly at will over your country and bomb whatever the fuck they like if you aim to have a stable and sovereign country. So clearly there's a lot that the Iranian government would need to do, but also there's tasks for revolutionaries inside Iran, of whom there are, I imagine, plenty, and who will be very well aware of all of the things that I've talked about, and will, of course, have a much better understanding of the situation facing them than I do. But it's clear that Iran has internal issues that need to be resolved if it's to be secured against US regime change operations, because the US, as has been made clear now, cannot hope to take on Iran toe-to-toe militarily and come out, well, theoretically, if the US mobilized 1.5 million men, drastically upscale its military production capacity, and was able to maneuver those men into a position where they could stage an invasion of Iran, well, some would argue the US would win that. I would argue that the Iranians wouldn't be anything like as obliging as Saddam Hussein, who dutifully sat there in 1991, watched 500,000 men land in Saudi Arabia and barely fired a shot at them. I don't think the Iranians would be so obliging as the Iraqi Baathists in that respect. It's also worth reminding ourselves that the 2003 invasion of Iraq went as quickly as it did in the initial phases, not because of US air power, but because the CIA and other intelligence agencies ahead of time effectively bought out and paid off a lot of Iraqi generals who stood down their men. Same thing happened in Libya. Libya was another one, by the way, like with Syria, where a big part of the problem facing those governments was the fact that, like, there was so much demoralization and utter corruption within the system. If you go back and you listen to the interview I did, must be a couple of years ago now, with Matteo Capasso, who wrote the book on life in the Libyan Islamic Jamahiriya. Capasso argues in that book, and talked about this when I spoke to him. He argued in that book that, like, the opening up of Libya to the West were basically did what the West was looking to do to Libya, or made it quicker with regard to what the West wanted to do to Libya. Whereas the assassination attempts against Gaddafi, the terrorist campaigns hadn't worked. By allowing large amounts of Western capital into Libya, what happened was that an awful lot of people inside that Libyan system just got bought by the US, by the British, by the French, and others. So this is a big part of the reason why the US wins its wars. It pays off people beforehand, and particularly in systems which are open to them, and they're able to move a large amount of money around in. They can buy all kinds of people. This is why, in the end, the Syrian government collapsed, because large numbers of Syrian government officials and military officers were bought via the money moved around by the Gulf states. So in the end, the state structure dissolved under Assad and around Assad, leaving him a man without a command structure beneath him, because the Gulf states had bought them all. Which is why I would say also, if I was Iranian, I'd be very, very circumspect about relations with the Gulf states. If they're moving money into Iran, there's only really one reason why they're doing it. And they're doing it as a conduit for their ultimate masters, which are, of course, Washington and London. So the Gulf states are a deeply poisonous, incredibly reactionary influence, which every serious revolutionary in West Asia has always understood them to be, and making nice with them because what Mohammed bin Salman says sometimes that they're in BRICS and sometimes that they're not, depends upon which day of the week it is or who he's talking to, so trusting the Saudis, the UAE, Qatar, etc., is a disastrous idea. These people still ultimately serve US imperialism and Britain, as does, by the way, our friend Mr. Erdogan in Turkey. Now, he likes to play both sides, of course, of many different equations, but ultimately the Turkish bourgeois' loyalty still lies to London and Washington, and he's still they might not care for Erdogan, but he's still a reliable servant of theirs and a reliable ally of the US ultimately. So trusting in him and the Turkish system is also a very, very bad idea if you aim to defend yourself against potential regime change operations. They are another conduit for all manner of corruption and all manner of sabotage operations that can be conducted in your country. So, a ceasefire, to sum up, a ceasefire provoked by the fact that the US's plan did not work, that the decapitation strategy did not lead to some sort of palace coup or color revolution, and and also prompted by the fact that Israeli society was pushed towards a greater level of crisis because of the Iranian response, and the US clearly needs to pause and recalibrate its options. So these are the reasons behind the ceasefire that's been put in place. Now, quite how long it lasts is another question entirely. We will come to that, I'm sure, in the questions and answers. So I'm just going to pause now and grab myself some more water, and then we'll get into Q&A. All right, welcome back, everybody. We will now get into questions and comments for a little bit. To answer Ogas Cybernetics' question, it's tap water. Because being in Scotland, we have some of the cleanest water in these cursed isles of ours. So, who we got with us tonight? Right, we got T.G. Wilson, Slumbering Colossus, Svetlana, Arcane Eclectic, David King. Svetlana says, "Are you aware that Zelensky's bunker in Kiev is on Bank Street, Banko Vyas Street?" Yeah. Yeah, quite literally making bank all the way. Hello to Sid, Javier, Grassy Knoll, Tracy Wilkinson, Albert, Jimmy S.W. Haster, ALM, Jenny, Thomas Wolfe, Peter, who's just joined us and is catching up. And we've got Almir, who says, when the Russians rejected the ceasefire in Ukraine, that they greatly eased my concern. Since then, I've been much less critical of the Russian government. Now I worry about Pezeshkian and his clique. Well, Pezeshkian and his clique are a lot more dangerous because they represent a faction that has more real power. I think that the nakedly comprador elements in Russia lost a lot of their power 20 years ago and have been sidelined ever since then. You've got sort of weaker bourgeois elements there now that would happily sell out in a moment, but can't advocate for that openly. They have to hide themselves behind a lot of nationalistic bullshit and a lot of Tsarism and stuff like that. Pezeshkian and his group and the people he represents have a real position of power in Iran, and that's why Iran's positions seem so schizophrenic sometimes. Hello to Abtin, and also to Dr. Ahmed, and to who else we got here? Sammy Git. A name, Potted Rodent. Hello to you all. Albert says bullshit. Trump Stein bends over for Israel. Albert, you're wrong. Completely wrong. Have you listened to anything I've said or others have said about the role of Israel with regard to its place in the US-led imperial system? Trump's not bending over for Israel. That's nonsense. Look at what Joe Biden said 40 years ago, which is he said if there were there not an Israel, it would be necessary for us to create an Israel to secure our interests. And again, look at how Theodore Herzl sold his project. We are a beachhead of the West, guarding against the Asian hordes, etc. It's a settler colony. All settler colonies are ultimately controlled by the parent state, no matter how much they scream and yell and jump up and down. And by the way, don't say bullshit to me again, okay? Robert, hello to you. If Israel needed the ceasefire, why did they violate it? Partly because Netanyahu had to, it was probably political more than anything else. Netanyahu had to secure himself. He had to secure himself from internal criticism, of which there will be plenty. He survives because the politics of the Israeli regime remain absolutely deadlocked. And this is a crisis-riddled entity that has essentially painted itself into a corner. He had to try and have the last word with the missile. As I've said, this ceasefire won't last because the objective requirements of US imperialism remain the same. And not just US imperialism, all of the imperialist bloc, the British, the French, the Germans, the Italians, they're all lined up with Israel. Why? Israel is doing their work. And if they lose Israel, if Israel implodes, they will lose their position in West Asia, their ability to influence things in West Asia. They will lose that because it won't just stop there. If Israel goes down, then the next on the chopping block will be the Gulf states. It'll be Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, etc., who aren't actually very strong states, who are impure. They're as fake a creation as Israel itself. They are all sponsored by imperialism. They've all been either British colonies or British neo-colonies, and they're all now sponsored by both Britain and America. They're fake creations, dependent upon like slave labor and indentured workers to survive. If Israel goes, another fake creation, all of these countries will disintegrate shortly afterwards. That's why the PFLP always said in their programs that they will ultimately have to, it'll ultimately, the liberation of the region depended upon destroying the Zionist regime, but also reactionary Arab states, of which there are plenty. It's not just the Gulf states, there's Jordan as well. Now, what's left of poor Syria, ruled over by a guy who's an MI6 asset in Julani. That's why he does podcasts with Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart. Okay, so who else we got here? We got T.G. Wilson says, utter BS from Trump, and analyzing Trump to understand how the world works, you might as well read tea leaves or read chicken innards. That's another one. Ben asks, have you heard a Cypriot mainstream MP sounded the alarm over all the Zionist refugees buying up massive swaths of property? I worry for Cyprus now. Well, the Cypriot ruling class have literally sold things out from under the islanders, from under the Cypriots. I hear that they're making extensive purchases in the north of Cyprus as well, but I haven't been able to confirm that. I had one person tell me that. But certainly they're buying up a lot in the south. Because why? This is like Israeli bourgeois getting themselves a ticket out. That's what's going to happen. If Israel goes down, the Israeli bourgeois will literally jump ship and set up Israel too in Cyprus, and they'll do to the Cypriots what they did to the Palestinians, with no objections. By the way, that'll be the way it goes if things go to shit inside Israel itself. Right. Abtin says they finally picked an opponent that can resist fully, and they lasted a few days against such an opponent until they had to surrender in the manner of Western imperialism, of course. Yeah, they can't fight directly. This is the point. They can't. They can wage hybrid wars. They can wage outsourced wars. They can, as I said, specialize in trying to collapse countries, exploiting their internal contradictions. But as many have said, or not many, but a few have said, including me and Kit, when we do the Decline and Fall show, they can't fight Russia directly. And for all their wild delusions, they can't fight China directly either. They can't fight Iran directly. They've got to use these other methods to try and bring down the Iranian government and bring down and destroy the Islamic Republic. And as long as the Islamic Republic remains compromised by elements of its own ruling class, then the US is going to have a foothold there, because that's where the biggest damage comes from. Let's scroll down. Well, interestingly, just to pick up on the comment about Israeli false flag operations, there's been plenty of them over the years, including against the Jews of Baghdad, of course. They did terrorist operations there against the Jewish population, trying to force their hand, to force them to go to Israel. There's stories about the fact that Mossad did this in other places as well. Look, the Zionist movement has always been incredibly cynical about the lives of Jews, because they are a tool to be used. That's been clear from the very beginning. And like some of the early Zionist writers had nothing but contempt for other Jews. So it's not about like the Jewish people. It's about a project which is dedicated to the service of Western imperialism, British imperialism, and now US imperialism. The Jewish population could be of Israel, the Zionists, the settlers, are disposable. Just the same way that Ukrainians are disposable. What, you think anybody in the US Congress thinks Ukrainians are special? Not really. Now, the Zionists have had longer to embed themselves in the US. They've had longer to build networks. They've had longer to do propaganda. But ultimately, if the US his interests move in a different direction, or if it's too costly and too difficult and too risky to maintain the Zionist regime, bye, goodbye. Nothing. There's nothing more cynical than an imperialist for disposing of a puppet regime. Right. Let's scroll down here. Just going down. Does U.S. imperialism turn its attention now to regime change in Venezuela? Asks President Jesus. Well, I don't think they've ever really stopped paying attention to Venezuela. And by the way, be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. They ran out of compradors to use. I mean, the Juan Guaido thing just turned into a complete joke. They never stop planning and plotting sabotage operations. It's not that these things stop. It's that sometimes the Venezuelans get a bit of breathing room because the US runs off elsewhere and throws all its efforts into that. But the plotting never stops. The sanctions haven't stopped. The trying to find the next Juan Guaido is an ongoing operation. So they might try that again. I mean, I still remain concerned about whatever the hell it is, like the most reactionary elements inside the US system are planning to do in or around Mexico. They keep talking about that. And again, it's not just, wild fascists like, McGregor, who's out of government, but like people like Rubio, people like Mayor Pete, remember him? He'll be making a comeback soon. Or they always talk about the cartels, which of course was bound up with US imperialism. This is something which has gone on, which everybody should be paying attention to, particularly as the Mexican government, headed by President Sheinbaum, continues to have a good degree of success. You're going to see more attempts by US imperialism to undermine and destroy that. This is something that we need to keep in mind and pay attention to. Yes, and Venezuela does still have a bourgeois element and a comprador bourgeois element right in the middle of them. Venezuela is saved time and again by the strength of the Bolivarian revolutionary movement amongst the masses, and because of the fact that the Venezuelan government decided to thoroughly purge the military of collaborators, and also started the process of forming like armed militias amongst the organized working class, all of which are factors in preserving the Bolivarian revolutionary process. But as long as there's a bourgeoisie there in Venezuela, as long as there's a bourgeoisie with powerful comprador elements within it, the Bolivarian revolution is going to be at risk. Question from Ulm. Brian Bear-Letich's analysis is clinical and informed by real-life experience within empire, but is without the ideological clarity you provide. Have you two ever been in contact? No, we have not. Never spoken to him. Never tried to either. We are, I think, engaged in different projects. Sid says the largest portion of American capital was exported from 2000 to 2008 during the height of globalization in the George W. Bush administration. Interesting point. Let's just scroll down for some more comments here. What are my thoughts on Professor Morandi? He's a very clearly a very learned man. He's a guy who, I believe he was brought up in the United States, unless I'm much mistaken, and went back to Iran after the revolution and fought in the Iran-Iraq war. I believe he was gassed. He's certainly a man with a good deal of courage, given that he clearly must be a target for the US given that he's an eloquent defender of the Iranian government and the Iranian nation, who routinely appears on Western television and gets the better of like howling gammon-faced wankers like Piers Morgan. Now, as to his belief system, from what I can tell, it's in line with the sort of the leadership of the Islamic Republic, which of course would put him in the opposite corner to me on a number of issues, given he is, I think, pretty openly an anti-communist. But then again, when it comes to facing up to the primary contradiction, which is, of course, decaying and rotting and extremely violent U.S. imperialism, we find ourselves with all manner of allies who are not necessarily communists, who might be opponents in other times. But when facing the primary contradiction, one must walk and form alliances with those who are prepared to fight it, including those who might be opposed to us on many other issues. Right. Just on the think tank question, I mean, think tanks are really interesting and worth studying because they're an expression in policy papers, in the form of policy papers, of the paid for opinions of the U.S. The U.S. ruling class, the opinions the U.S. ruling class pays for, and so it's interesting to see what they're paying for. Well, to answer David King's question, I hope that the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians read the policy papers produced by the think tank world in Washington, D.C., because that's the U.S. ruling class openly telling you what they're going to do. And they're not lying in a lot of those papers either, because they're talking to themselves, so they don't need to lie. Well, it's not just a question of the nuclear weapon, to answer President Jesus' point. It's also a question of the fact that Iran needs some to address its internal problems, security and political problems, and it needs to purge the pro-US element, essentially, one way or the other. Now, those people eventually got sidelined. Some of them got imprisoned. Some of them got exiled from Russia. The Chinese have been doing something of a job on that over the last decade, of finding the direct agents of the US and the British and locking them up or executing them, or both, and imprisoning those who are corrupt within the system, who are either agents of the US and the British, or who are at risk of being or compromised, who could be recruited by the Anglo-Americans. And so the Russians and the Chinese have been making serious attempts to shut down the networks run by their enemies. Like, it's clear the Iranians need to do that. And what the Russians and the Chinese have been correct in doing is identifying the source, or some of the sources of the problem. I would argue that there are other sources of the problem which the Chinese aren't addressing, but they've been identifying the people at the top who are the problem. So that's why you've seen so many executives and senior party officials get sent down. It's because essentially it's a rolling purge of the leadership done by the Chinese party to try and rid themselves of the worst elements. The Russians rid themselves of like the Berezovsky clique and Khodorkovsky and people like that. There's still a lot of dubious motherfuckers inside the Russian system, don't get me wrong, but the worst and most naked comprador elements have gone or been marginalized, to say the least. Right. It's not a question of naivety. S.W. Haster says, I found the Iranian government so beautifully naive. It's not beautiful and it's not naive. It's an expression of class interests. It's an expression of the class interests of the people who back the Pezeshkian government. And so it's not naivety. Oh, they're just naive. No. They are people who understand that their interests lie in collaboration with US imperialism. So it's not naivety. These people Some of these people understand exactly what they're doing. Others who serve them are idiots who imagine that if you just grovel enough, the US will leave you alone. Of course they won't. But the effect of these people is the same, whether they're conscious traitors or whether they're just fools. The effect is the same, which is your country gets destroyed. So there's no mercy for traitors and no mercy for fools either, is what I would say. Sid says Gaddafi had a lot of questionable relations with US and other Western intelligence outfits over the decades of his rule. He was a very suspicious figure in many ways. Yeah, I mean, he was kind of a non-aligned figure. He had connections with like British intelligence. Now, whether he purged those and rejected those ties, I'm not sure. He was certainly a figure that was all over the place. But he was a figure like Saddam Hussein, in some respects, who had the space to exist for a while in the Cold War, because there was, of course, the US was obliged to tolerate like certain elements that were around, that had relations with both sides, like the Baathists, like Gaddafi to a degree. But as soon as the Cold War ended, then it was time to wrap all those up. Titoites, Baathists, Gaddafi, anybody else who thought that they could stand outside the new US global neo-colonial system, all of whom pushed to one side. Doesn't matter. As Edward Shevardnadze wept once, but I was the US's greatest friend. How did it all go so wrong? Well, Edward, they got what they wanted out of you, and then you're overboard. Done. We found a lunatic lawyer to take your place who'll eat his tie on national television. Tracy Wilkinson says Arabs have made backstabbing an art. Well, every culture, every group has wretched figures within it. The Arab ruling classes of the comprador regimes are certainly a disgusting bunch, but I would say don't tar the masses with the rotten brush that you use on the rule to define the ruling class. If you look at like the way that the Palestinians have fought so hard and so long against the Israeli regime, certainly they are exemplars of loyalty and courage. Now, if you're talking about the regimes in Riyadh or Doha, then yeah, you're exactly right. These are a bunch of backstabbing mercenaries who would sell their own mothers for cash, or the wretched King of Jordan, for instance. But be careful not to tar the masses with the brush of the rulers, because how would that define British people? How would you define us if you if you judged us off the content of the character of our ruling class? How would one judge us? It's an interesting question, isn't it? Right. Nehat says, true about the Turkish bourgeois. People in Turkey are silent but very frustrated with the rulers. We believe the rulers are kidnapped behind closed doors by finance capital. I don't think they need to be kidnapped. It just needs to be presented with the alternatives. Collaborate with the US imperialism and you'll receive a very profitable pension and a very nice financial contribution. Try to free Turkey from US imperial domination, you'll probably end up dead. And that is the deal that Erdogan took, I think, a very long time ago. Miguel Carvalho says, how strong is the Communist Party in Iran and how can it use these latest events to mobilize the masses? Tudeh Party, I don't think, has much of an influence inside Iran itself. I would need to do more research before going further into that. So, Miguel, please email me that question and I'll bring it up if I'm able to get Comrade Bahman Azad back on the program. SWH says, Alex, now that Iran realizes US cannot be trusted, how likely do you think the Iranian government will pursue acquiring nuclear weapons as a deterrent? To be confirmed, to answer your question. It's certainly They certainly shouldn't collaborate with the IAEA. They certainly shouldn't listen to anybody who says don't acquire one. But also, it's not just a question of acquiring one. It's like it's not just the case. Like people say, the DPRK got a nuclear weapon and now no one fucks with them. Well, yes, that's true, but the DPRK was strong enough to put off US imperialism even before they had the nuclear weapon. Why? Because the DPRK leadership made the correct decision that they needed to have conventional military that would do severe damage to the US if it tried something on the Korean Peninsula. And though, of course, the US imperialists engage in constant provocations against the DPRK, even before they were confirmed to have the nuclear weapon, I would have regarded it as extremely unlikely that the US would have made a run at reopening the Korean War. Precisely because even before the acquisition of the nuclear deterrent by the DPRK, they had an army that was powerful enough, well trained enough, and well motivated enough to, at the very least, do commit themselves to the defense of their country in a way that would do an extreme amount of damage to the US and would have left the US facing mass casualties. And that comes from the fact that the DPRK's internal political system is overseen by the Workers' Party of Korea, which, from all the reading I've done on it, remains embedded in and very close to the masses. You have an army which is not only extensive and is military service required of most adults in the DPRK, but also works for the masses, engages in construction projects, isn't an army which lives like a parasite upon the state. It is an army which is dedicated to the service of the Korean people and would defend their country with a good deal of determination and skill which has been enhanced, of course, now by their exposure to modern combat techniques through their collaboration with the Russians in the special military operation. So it's not just a question of getting the bomb. As Marxists, we should consider this in an all-around way. It's not just a question of Iran gets nukes and then it's all done, because Pakistan has nukes, and the US is always fucking with them, partly because the Pakistani officer corps is so ludicrously corrupt and has been in bed with the US for many, many years, and before that the British. But the way in which this is viewed, I think, is too one-sided. It's no good getting the bomb if your internal system is rotten. It's no good getting a nuclear weapon if the people running your government and the influential people within society and the state, if the ruling class itself or the ruling element is looking to capitulate to US imperialism at the first available opportunity. Nobody had more nuclear weapons than the 1980s Soviet Union. And yet, what happened to them? They were overcome partially by internal failures and partially by external subversion. You see my point? It's not just a question of Iran gets the bomb and then the US backs off. The US has a lot of other methods to subvert Iran. Doesn't have to launch a frontal assault. In fact, I would still argue that it's very unlikely to launch a frontal assault, especially after this fuck up that they've just engaged in, where they did damage to Iran, but they didn't come close to attaining their objectives. So again, I wouldn't be if Iran pursues a nuclear weapon, then ultimately that is something which would deliver a certain degree of security, but it would not resolve the issues. So the DPRK resolved its security issues by refusing to tolerate the presence of foreign agents on their soil, by withdrawing cooperation from things like the IAEA, which is completely riddled with American, Israeli, and British spies, but also because they were able to, again, their internal systems are something which actually gives them great strength, because they do mobilize the masses. The WPK is embedded amongst the workers of the DPRK, and the cadres of the WPK move and live amongst the workers and do not elevate themselves above them. And that is the strongest component here. That is what the basis upon which everything else works, which is the internal system in the DPRK, is conducted correctly. And so again, it's not just a question of having the nukes. It's not that Iran gets a nuke and problem solved. You see what I mean? Orban's heading, love Trump, hate Brussels, is made empty when Ursula at the current NATO summit at the Hague promising sanctions. We in Slovakia just veto. They are one organization. Yeah. Right. Okay. Just scrolling through some more comments here. If I don't get to your question tonight, be sure to email it to me and I'll get to it in the next Q&A. Nemo Yederman says, Alex, do you think that the Israeli Zionists are the Pied Noir of the Levant and will meet the same fate ultimately as the Pied Noir of Algeria? I would say so, yes. In a weird way, you're more likely to get some of the dirt poor Arab Jews, the Jews who originated from Arab countries, staying there if they can get a deal with whoever comes next after the US agent Netanyahu flees the scene. But yeah, an awful lot of them are just going to pick up the second passport and fuck off to Europe or the United States, and will be found in Florida and various other sort of places of exiled settler types and comprador elements in Florida, bitterly reflecting on what they've lost and accusing the US of treason and toasting to their glorious return to the promised land one day that never quite arrives. Netanyahu has said Pakistan is next on the list. Pakistan forms a land bridge between Iran and China. Their dream's ridiculous. Yeah, they're not going to be able to go after Pakistan. Besides, Pakistan itself has a lot of problems, and also they until very recently, they didn't need to go after Pakistan because it was tied to the US for so long. Now, because of its extensive relations with China, they may try something. In fact, the US tries stuff all the time in Pakistan. What do you think the Balochi separatists are all about? But it's an interesting way of expressing it. I mean, Netanyahu sprays a lot of bullshit around. But he's often speaking for like the most wild reactionary elements in the United States, which is who he's always spoken for. That's the power that he has. And that's why that's why every US president hates him, because like he's been very successful. He's a very successful asset of the most reactionary elements in the US ruling class and the US military intelligence state. That's where his power is derived from, which is why he can go and play hardball with the US president, because first of all, Netanyahu is a long-term resident of the United States. His family lives there. But also because he's embedded in all these networks and he's their chosen man to run Israel as the attack dog that it's meant to be. And that's why he's been as successful as he has. Abolish NATO asks, do you ever see Haz's analysis of how smaller countries are usually more reactionary than larger countries? I haven't seen it, so I can't comment on it, basically. But Baltics, though, essentially, I'd say that Baltics and Ukraine and Israel belong in a different category to like Britain. I haven't seen Haz's analysis of British imperialism, so I'm not going to comment on like that. But I would say that the British play a significant role in running the other three. So again, there's a lot of mistakes made by analysts regarding British imperialism since really the end of World War II. That it was this withered, useless husk that was basically just kept alive by the US. And there's elements of truth in that, but you miss if you don't analyze it properly, what you will end up doing is missing the moves that British imperialism has repeatedly made to secure itself, and so not only that, to make sure its interests are served. It's an alliance with its 100-year alliance with Ukraine, a joke, in many respects, but is not meant to be that the British imperialism will defend Ukraine. It is meant to prop up the Ukrainian regime and give the British more and more control over it. And that's what the British are very good at. The British ruling class are very good at. They're good at manipulating and puppeteering other states. So the British have a huge influence in all the Baltic states. They have a huge influence in Ukraine. They have a huge influence, unspoken a lot of the time, in Israel and Saudi and the UAE and other Gulf states. So this is the point that I would make about the British. You have to unravel a lot of bullshit, which is often put out there by the British ruling class. Like this idea that the British ruling class are just simple pawns of the Americans. It isn't true. Yes, they need the Americans. They need the US. They need the US to do the muscle work for them in a lot of places. But you read like the stuff that Kit puts out and other stuff about like British power. And this is one of the reasons why we do the Decline and Fall show. It's to demonstrate just how dangerous a collection of psychopathic reactionaries the British ruling class really are. Completely parasitic, unable to actually fight toe-to-toe with anybody anymore. But because they've got so much capital at their disposal, and they have so much cultural capital as well that they're able to deploy, they are a force that is still dangerous in the world. And that is something which more people need to be aware of. Do I think that Iran was foolish to agree to a ceasefire? Only time will tell on that one, because it will be foolish if they don't use this time to start addressing their internal problems. If the US is able to come back and take another stab at them, I doubt it'll be a frontal assault again, but some other way, and their internal issues aren't resolved, then it would be foolish. But again, it'll be a time will tell will be the answer on that one. Right. Just going through some questions here. SW Haster says, remember Silver Corps? Private mercenary group sent to Venezuela but caught. Interesting. I've not heard the name. Does the dog prefer Scotland to Manchester? Well, a different dog. But I'll leave you to work out this dog was already in Scotland. Alex B says, why do you think Blumenthal, Mate, Greenwald, etc. keep saying Israel is manipulating the US to do evil things? Could they be part of some elaborate intelligence scheme or just ignorant? Don't know if they're, Greenwald, I think, is a bit dodgy, to be honest. I think that guy has certainly made his bargains with some very powerful individuals in the past. When it comes to, particularly when it came to like the Snowden files and stuff like that, he had some dodgy deals going on with Pierre Omidyar. So I regard Greenwald as a bit of a dubious character, to be honest. He's certainly done some shady business in the past, and by all accounts, his own politics are utter dog shit. What I don't want to speculate on what like Blumenthal and Mate are doing, because both of them, Blumenthal especially, has great knowledge of Israel. I think I will say I think they're making a political mistake, because there is a delusion amongst the US left and the US right as well, that the US has no interests in the kind of the belligerent aggression engaged in by Israel. Of course, this is a failure of the politics of these individuals, because what it does is it neglects to understand properly the US role as the successor and inheritor of a lot of the work done by the British Empire. And once you understand that the US took over the running of a lot of British imperialist projects and started to use, of course, the tactics of British imperialism, and did so because the US is the #1 imperialist power in the world and has been for 80 years, then the alliance with Israel makes complete sense that they would take over the running of that. So I would also say that I think for some of these people, they think that by putting things in this manner, that they can reach the sort of, the more conscious Trump voter by saying, "Oh, it's not in U.S. interests to do that," or that Trump sold out the U.S. to Israel. People think that they can make an impression on Trump supporters by doing that. In my view, this is an erroneous way of working. This doesn't, because I think it is my job as a communist to actually make the relationships of power clear to the masses. So Israel being a tool of the US and the British needs to be made clear to people, and it needs to be made clear to the workers, as the working class, as to why the services of the Zionists were employed by the British and then the US, why Israel exists, why it is in the interests of the British and the US ruling classes to employ it in the way that they do. And I think some people have made the calculation, if they keep saying that Trump sold us out to Israel or Biden sold us out to Israel, they can tap into the nationalistic sentiments of like the MAGA base. Or say, as some people ludicrously do, that the US has surrendered sovereignty to Israel. It's a completely idiotic position. But I'll go back to the point. Communists should be making the relations of power clear to the masses, even if the masses don't want to hear it, even if the masses rebel against it, even if the masses aren't there yet. We need to keep, when it comes to questions of imperialism, we need to keep making the point about the fact that this is done in the interest of the American ruling class, not in the interest of the US working class. And because that helps us drive the point home about imperialism and the class division within the imperial core, not pretend that there is this national interests of the US or Britain or wherever that hovers out there, which isn't subject to class relations. The national interests of the United States, as the United States is currently constituted, are the interests of the US ruling class. They're not the interests of the US worker. They're not the interests of the US worker who's getting poorer every year. It's not in the interest of the US worker that the Syrians or the Iranians are crushed, or the Libyans are crushed, or the Palestinians are crushed. It's not in their interests. It's in the interest of the US ruling class. And that needs to be spelt out explicitly to the US working class. All this shit about like, oh, Israel runs America, or like or Trump sold out to Israel, or Biden sold out to Israel. Fucking nonsense. And if you're engaging in that, you're an idiot, quite frankly, or you are severely misinformed. Severely misinformed. And if you're a public figure who has a big platform and has a lot of reach, then you're giving a wholly false impression of the situation. That is a very foolish way of using that influence. The true relationship is that that Israel is not an independent entity. And the Israeli ruling class all have their interests and their roots, or a huge proportion of them do, in the United States itself, like all settler colonies. And therefore, if the US really doesn't want Israel to do something, then Israel won't do it, because they can't do anything, again, unless it's murdering civilians, without the US to back them up. That's why they backed out of this war with Iran. Abtin says, politicized Sunni reactionaries often claim that Iran is in bed with Israel. It's as stupid an assertion as where Israel runs the USA. Sid says, Israel never has controlled the US. Yeah. I regard people making those arguments as either very foolish or spreading deliberate disinformation. I'm going to go and be generous and say that most of it is foolishness. And as Aid says, Israel is not a state, it's an instrument, a blunt instrument used by the British to used by the British to brutalize West Asia. Yes. Well, Rupert, I get angry when I see idiocy. Now, if you can take yourself the fuck out of here, because quite frankly, I'm tired of reading all this shit from people who keep circling the plug hole with this argument about Israel controls this, that, or the other, because it doesn't, and you're giving people completely the wrong impression. And I've heard this for on and off for 25 years since I first got politically active, and it's garbage. And these people sound the same as the Zionists. The Zionists would love you to believe that they have this web of influence and control and that they're everywhere. They work for the imperialists. That's where their power comes from. When the imperialists get bored of them or sick of them or decide they're no longer a good investment, that power will disappear. Disappear overnight. And yes, there's a lot of ideological ties there. There's a lot of shit about Israel as the beachhead of Western civilization. There have been other places that are called the beachhead of Western civilization. Read what the atheist Herzl had to say about Israel's services to the British Empire as it was then, or the British's intentions in setting this up, or the other puppets that the British have had over the years. Do your research and grow up and stop pushing narratives that the Zionists designed themselves, basically. And if you don't like that, then take yourself over to another channel. Take yourself over to one of the other bland multipolarists who'll tell you exactly what you want to believe in between quaffing tequila and telling you that the great and final collapse of the United States is just around the corner, and all we need to do is keep posting, lads. You want people who are going to spoon feed you bullshit and tell you interesting stories, take your pick of other channels, because I don't need you here, basically, and I don't need you, and I don't owe you anything, and nobody does. You want to go and be entertained? Go and be entertained. There's plenty of people out there who'll give you all kinds of interesting stories. I'm not here to tell you stories, basically. And go and find yourself another storyteller. Right, okay. To finish on a quote from T.G. Wilson, who says, Israel goes back to white supremacists like Lord Palmerston in 1860 in the US Blackstone 1890s, who Brandeis called the father of Zionism. Indeed. Okay, so going to bring it to a close here for this evening. Thanks to all 646 of you who are watching. I'll be back again with you tomorrow. It'll be another Decline and Fall episode then. So thanks to everybody who's tuned in tonight. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Be sure to read the new Substack article, which is out today, and it's and I'll be doing a series of them on the US-Iran war, which should be its correct title. So thanks to everybody for tuning in. Back with you again tomorrow. I'm going to leave you with Scenes from a War.
Allahu Akbar, Khomeini Rahbar. Allahu Akbar, Khomeini Rahbar.
این بانگ آزادی کز خاوران خیزد، فریاد انسان هاست کز نای جان خیزد، اعلام توفان هاست کز هر کران خیزد، آتش فشان قهر ملت های در بند است، حبل المتین توده های آرزومند است. دشمن بداند ما موج خروشانیم، زایده بحریم، فرزند توفانیم، در سنگر اسلام بگذشته از جانیم، بازو به بازو صف به صف ما آهنین چنگیم. سنگر به سنگر جان به کف آماده جنگی. تخت شهنشاهان شد سرنگون از ما، تخت تبهکاران شد واژگون از ما، دامان آزادی شد لالگون از ما. ما حافظ آزادی و اسلام و قرآنیم، ما در پی آسایش و معراج انسانیم.
الله اکبر خمینی رهبر، الله اکبر خمینی رهبر.
ما در ره اسلام پیمان خون بستیم، زنجیر استعمار مردان بگسستیم، از دام اهریمن با یاد حق رستیم. ما نغمه الله اکبر بر زبان داریم، ما چون خمینی رهبری روشن روان داریم.
الله اکبر خمینی رهبر،